Hi, everybody. Welcome to our video on flipped learning, brought to you by the math department at Champlain College. That is Melanie Brown, Michael Opperman, and Warren Sides. So, the basic game plan here, we've got two videos for you. Basically going over some of the important questions you might have about flipped learning. What is flipped learning? How does one go about flipping a class? What are our experiences with it? Why did we implement it with our classes? And probably most important to us right now, how does flipping translate to a remote or hybrid environment? So this video is part one, where we're going to give you an overview of flipped learning and really focus on those first two questions. What is flipped learning, and how does one go about flipping a class?
All right, so what is flipped learning? It depends on who you ask, but we're going to be basing our information on at least these two resources and a little bit more later on. So, resource by Robert Talbert and Barbie Honeycutt. All of this information will be presented and available through the CLT, so feel free to click the hyperlinks later and check out these resources. Specifically, we're going to operate with this definition of what is flipped learning. Flipped learning is a pedagogical approach in which first contact with new concepts moves from the group learning space to the individual learning space in the form of structured activity, and the resulting group space is transformed into a dynamic, interactive learning environment where the educator guides students as they apply concepts and engage creatively in the subject matter. This is directly from the Flipped Learning Network. We read it through Talbert. It goes further to explain the four pillars of flipped learning, and I'll outline them here briefly, but again, the resources are available to you. So obviously, spelling the word flip, the F for flexible environment basically means that when you're in the classroom, you have different modes of delivery and different ways for students to present their knowledge, either in group or individual, and also that professors are flexible with how they sort of time the assignments and give students a chance to learn on their own. The L, the learning culture, this is really just a shift from a sort of teacher-centric learning to a student-centered learning style. The emphasis on making sure that the student is having their time to learn in the classroom and it's not all about the professor. I for intentional content, I'm going to make sure that the content is created in such a way to maximize that group time, to make sure that students are getting the most out of that time with the professor. So generating pre-class work that is meaningful and guided towards that interaction, and also post work that follows up nicely with reflection. So the content is intentional. And finally, the professional educator. This is the role of the professor, not so much as a lecturer, but someone who is constantly observing and interacting with the class while they are going through the process, and therefore actually a slightly more sort of hands-on and activity-based educator. Flipped learning is not videos before class and homework during class, as we are so wont to do. It is also not assigning readings before class and discussing reading in class, and is definitely not a way to cover twice as much content. The first two, the videos and the discussions, are definitely components of a flipped classroom, but that is not the idea of flipped learning, to just switch everything out so that you have time to interact in the classroom.
So, how does one flip a class? Very carefully. There's so much about flipping that is all about that intentionality. And so really thinking about your course content so that you can identify clear learning outcomes for your students. And that's going to enable you then to create those structured pre-class activities, that meaningful content explored in class, and then those formative post-class assessments. Again, that intentionality piece to make sure that you're really thinking about what you want your students to be getting out of each component of the course. So as an example of what a flipped class flow looks like, I had an opportunity to do a flipped classroom when I taught at St. Mike's in the 2012-2013 academic year. And in linear algebra, that was the one that we flipped. So before each class, students were assigned a section to read and were given guided reading questions to answer as they read. So that was kind of that prep work beforehand. So then in class, the time was spent with a mini review of basic terminology and the key ideas from their reading, and then group work focusing on on different examples where students got to explore the ideas and the vocabulary from their pre-reading. And then after class, it was a traditional homework set. So we see that very clear pre-class activity, meaningful in-class work, and then post-class assessment.
So one of the important aspects of this is to make sure the students are accountable when they enter your classroom. So you want to make sure that they are aware of what they're responsible for. Otherwise, it's not going to work out very well, and things might end up looking the same as you try and restate all the things you expected them to do beforehand. So in a couple of instances of the readings, there are some suggestions, like a ticket to enter. Perhaps you require students to bring something with them from that pre-class to be allowed to actually participate in the lesson that day. Or you give them something that has a this or that outcome, where they have to choose a side when they come in. Maybe they write their name on a Post-it and stick it on one side or the other on the board when they enter the room to demonstrate that they will be supporting one side or the other in today's discussion. Another option is pass the problem resource sheet, where say you're giving traditional testing and you're going to allow them to use notes for something, and they're only allowed to use the notes that they created before entering the room that day. And so that will make them have to think about very actively what they find important or not, just like they sat in on a lecture in a traditional way. And Robert Talbert uses Google Forms before each class, which is a series of leading questions that lets the students realize what were the important things they were supposed to take away from that pre-class to bring with them into the classroom to be prepared for that discussion that day. Now, there's also a listing of a lot of things that people make as a mistake, and this is a lot of anecdotal evidence of things that people tried and failed, and try and help others not make the same mistakes. So these are 7 common mistakes to try to think about beforehand and see if you can avoid making. The first one is narrowly defining what the flipped classroom is. Let yourself be flexible in the design and idea of it, and open to what it could mean for you. Don't narrowly focus on, well, so-and-so said it means this. It has this narrow definition that isn't as open to what you would need it for. Second one, and this is one of the most important things, make sure the objectives are well articulated to the students. When they don't fully understand what they're doing and supposed to get out of it, that leads to problems and a lot of confusion, and they end up not getting as much out of the experience as they should. The third one, not planning. Going in and just thinking you can wing it because you know the material tends to adversely affect the process, because the students may not be able to adapt as easily as you might. If the activity is too big for your class time, that leads to problems as well, because the whole point is it's something that you can guide them through. Having them continue it for homework kind of defeats the purpose. Another aspect is thinking you have to flip every single thing you do. That's not necessarily the case. If you have a lesson that works really well as a presentation by you in class with a lot of active discussion, don't think that has to now become a flipped lesson just because all the classes before and after have been flipped. It's very important as well to make sure the students are aware of their role and responsibility in this, as well as your role and responsibility for this. You are guiding them as an educator. You are not simply lecturing to them information. They're not just simply sitting there passively taking notes.
Now, one of the aspects of flipped learning is reflection, especially on the professor's part. What's working, what's not working, and being able to change. So I think we're going to end here with some critical questions about learning. These are open-ended. I don't think any of us claim to have answers to these, but they do make you think in a different way about the whole learning process in general, but specifically about flipped learning. So one of the first questions that you might get from a student, or a frustration you might hear from a student, is something like, I wish you'd just teach the class. Right? But a better question might be something like, why do we have classes? Right? If the student's idea is that a class is held so that a professor can stand and teach, then maybe that's something we should address and consider.
So another common question is, I learn best, or comment rather, is I learn best when listening to a lecture. And then the question becomes, well, how does one learn? I know, as having done some readings in my personal experience with this, is that if you phrase it another way and ask the students things like, what have you learned in your life? That's really important. Things like, well, you learned how to talk, how to feed yourself, how to get from place to place. Those are not things where you sit in a room and somebody gives you a step-by-step lecture on how to accomplish that. So it lets the students refocus on possibly the learning process, not as a you sit, I talk, and you fill in some information, but this whole collective understanding of you have to do and process in a different way.
And third, the comment, well, I shouldn't have to teach myself the subject. Well, the better question is, why are we here in the first place? Students are in our classes to learn, and helping them recognize that there are a lot of different ways for them to engage in that learning process, I think is a really important piece of flipping.
So as we wrap up this first part of the flipped classroom instructional slides, here are a few resources, specifically from Robert Talbert's GitHub, talking about things like the 7 steps as he designs his flipped classrooms and as a workbook, a guided practice example of a typical cryptography lesson, where here's the pre-class and here's how he approaches that, as well as some other resources with his inverted classroom resource list.
And again, this concludes part 1, which is our overview of active learning. If you've got questions on any of the content from part 1, please feel free to email us. Again, this is Melanie Brown, Michael Opperman, and Warren Sides, and you can contact us with our Champlain email addresses. If you're interested in learning more about how we actually implemented these ideas in our own classes, we encourage you to check out our video part 2 to get answers to those last 3 questions from our opening slides. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to this, and we're happy to support you in your own flipping adventures. Thanks.